You're listening to The Conversation. It's the 11th of September, 2001.
Hijacked planes crash into and destroy the towers of the World Trade Center.
Within hours, Russian President Vladmir Putin picks up the phone and calls George W. Bush. He's the first international leader to do so. It's a gesture meant to signal Putin's commitment to partnership with the West. So, what went wrong? To understand Russia's view of the world now and its aggression towards Ukraine, it helps to know more about the psyche of the country and its leader. Today, how a sense of national humiliation hardened the tough man regime and led Russia to turn its back on the West. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. James Rogers, you're an associate professor in international journalism at City St George's University of London in the UK, and you've just published a new book called The Return of Russia, From Yeltsin to Putin, The Story of a Vengeful Kremlin. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Gemma.
James, so the title of your book suggests that there was a departure before the return. What is Russia returning from?
It's about Russia having lost its status as a superpower in the late 20th century, having been absent from the international stage and returned in the warlike manner that we've seen in the last few years.
And why does that return matter right now, where we are at this moment, 4 years after Russia invaded Ukraine?
I think because still 4 years after the escalation of that invasion in February 2022, we see that this remains the biggest security threat to European security as a whole. The conflict so far shows no sign of ending. The peace talks that have been underway have hit serious obstacles, largely over territory. And we've seen all sorts of suggestions that Russia is trying to interfere in other countries as well. We've seen these mysterious drone flights disrupting air traffic in Denmark and elsewhere.
News from Denmark. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has called a drone incident at Copenhagen's airport the most serious attack to date on the nation's critical infrastructure.
So Russia is very definitely back. It's come back in a different way than from arguably when the Soviet Union was a European security threat in the last century. But very sadly, it's come back in a way that I don't think anyone anticipated 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War.
Let's go back to that point in history. Because when discussing Russia's relationship with the West, it's often looked at in relation to decisions made in the 2000s. But your book really takes us further back and pinpoints what was happening in the 1990s. In the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union.
The former Soviet republics have dissolved the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin tells President Gorbachev to resign now with dignity.
Can you take us back to that period and tell us what was the economic situation like back then?
The economic situation was absolutely dire. And I think alongside that, there was a huge shock. These people thought they lived in the greatest country on earth, and there were very few people who had the opportunity to find out any differently. So suddenly, from the 1980s onwards, the economy really starts to grind to a halt to the extent that there are shortages of really basic foodstuffs, long queues. I mean, it's remarkable what a searing image those were for so many people in the West. When the prices were freed at the end of the planned economy, there was a massive economic shock just for ordinary people. Prices went through the roof. Those savings that they had disappeared very rapidly.
People here are buying up as fast as they can, trying to spend their rubles while they still have some value. Twice already this decade, they've seen their savings wiped out by inflation.
In 1998, Russia defaulted on its domestic debt with, again, a currency crisis, a ruble falling rapidly against the dollar, with the consequence that any imported goods, and there were plenty because Russian manufacturing was not in a great shape then, imported goods also rocketed in price. So really a time of great instability. But in my book, I term it the time of humiliation, in the sense that people felt this great loss of status with the coming of new Western ideas of the free market. And a lot of people lost their jobs and the status that went with them. And alongside that, Russia also lost the standing on the world stage that the Soviet Union had enjoyed.
And the West was involved too. There was shock therapy going on. There were lots of consultants coming over from Western nations trying to tell Russia what to do. What do you think the West expected would actually happen after 1991?
This was the time, of course, when Francis Fukuyama wrote his essay, The End of History, in which, broadly speaking, he suggested that the system that prevailed at the end of the Cold War, that of liberal capitalist democracy, prevailed over Soviet socialism. That was the defining system. And I think this led to a number of things on the Western side. It led, naturally enough, to a sense of relief. Let's not forget that the 1980s was a time of very serious nuclear rearmament, of more US cruise missiles being deployed in Western Europe. And so there was a sense of relief, but there was also a sense of triumph. We have George Bush saying, by the grace of God, we won the Cold War. And it's completely understandable that there would be this sense of relief. But I think also there was a failure perhaps to look longer term at what the consequences of this might be. There was a failure to understand in Russia just how people there were feeling. I remember a talk that a former British ambassador to the Soviet Union gave here in London in 2011, 20 years after the end of the Soviet Union. And he was talking in terms of, the people he'd been dealing with at the Soviet Foreign Ministry to prepare big summits and so on, with leaders coming. He suddenly found himself talking to them again about the delivery of humanitarian aid, because the Soviet economy had collapsed to such an extent that they were reliant to a degree on handouts from former Cold War foes.
And that really feeds into that idea of humiliation.
I think it does. And I think everything suddenly had changed. Remember, these people had been educated for more than 7 decades that under capitalism, a few people would be wealthy and everybody else would have next to nothing. And that is to a very large extent actually what transpired in the first few years afterwards. That's not to say it was all doom and gloom. There was a sense of excitement. There was a sense of new possibilities. But for an awful lot of ordinary people, the vast majority of them, it was an extremely difficult time.
By the mid-1990s, you've got a situation where around 40% of the population is poor. We've got oligarchs seizing state assets, institutions in complete disarray, and power and money becoming increasingly concentrated, as you say. How did the collapse of the economy affect attitudes in Russia towards the West and what they thought that free market would bring them?
To begin with, I think there was a real open mind about this. I think there was a hope that there was an understanding that generally people in the West had a better standard of living. There was also no regret at the passing of the Cold War or in the former Eastern Bloc either. I think everybody was glad, and this is very much something for my generation. Great sense of relief that the threat of nuclear war had receded to the extent that it had. But I think it just didn't deliver. Boris Yeltsin, the president who had been elected as the first president of the Russian Federation in 1991 and was president until 1999, he had delivered the change but was unable to deliver the better standards of living that were supposed to come with it. And I think that's really where the disappointment starts to set in. And yes, that inequality. By 1999, half of Russia's wealth is in the hands of 10% of the population.
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin, began to establish the Putin...
In 1999, Putin becomes president. And then just a few years later, in 2001, the US went to war in the Middle East, first in Afghanistan.
The United States military has begun strikes in Afghanistan.
And then Iraq.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
You've spoken to people who were involved at the time. How did these events shape Putin's view of the West, of the US, and also of Russia's place in the world?
I think in 2 different ways, because Putin, of course, famously was the first world leader to call George W. Bush on 9/11 and to offer his support, and he uses the phrase, Russia knows what terrorism means. He's referring there to fighting against the insurgency in the North Caucasus. We are your allies, in effect, he's saying, in the war on terror. And so Russia was very keen to help the United States. And there was a time, I think, when he was hoping that this terrible misfortune which had befallen the United States might in some ways lead to a better relationship between the two. Iraq, I think, is a very different matter. Remember that Russia had extensive economic interests in Iraq at the time of the war. And remember, too, Russian foreign intelligence knew that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. With that knowledge, and they were certain that the CIA and other Western agencies knew the same thing, they determined that the West was acting in bad faith, and the reasons they'd given for going to war in Iraq, and this was actually about regime change and not at all about weapons of mass destruction. That the current UK National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, for whom I interviewed in the book, he was Tony Blair's chief of staff for the entire time that he was in office. And he was very clear to me. He said, the Americans might say something different, but for us, the British, I'm certain that it was the Iraq war that broke it, because Putin just felt that the West ignored Russia's protests about their business interests there, about their historical ties to the country, and went ahead with the invasion in the way that they did. And if they can do this to Saddam Hussein, then maybe one day the West will try to decide to do it for me.
That belief in Russia, the West knew that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. How did that actually change the way Russia reacted towards the West?
I think they became deeply suspicious of Western motives in international relations, and particularly in the launching of the two wars that you've mentioned. And also, let's think about the time, because just later that year, we have the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and the year after that, we have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So at this point, Putin is looking at the countries of the former Soviet Union, seeing people he felt as trusted allies, or certainly maybe in some cases even supporters of him, being replaced by governments that are looking very firmly westwards and looking to join the European Union, and more worryingly for Putin, NATO.
And what did this all mean then for the way Russia and Putin would go on to rationalize and legitimize their own interventions that followed?
When Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, they saw an opportunity where the West was unwilling to act, and they intervened in that civil war decisively, as it turned out, at least in the short term, to support one of their allies. And for that, Russia is sending a signal to the rest of the world saying, look, these are our allies. We will stand by them. We will not let them be pushed out by any of your color revolutions. And we, having seen what happens in Libya, having seen in other countries what happens when you remove a long-term leader, we're not going to stand for that chaos. We're going to support the existing powers that be, because that's what we want to see. We're not about removing people from power only for anarchy to follow. But secondly, the intervention in Syria also said, we're back on the world stage. You and the United States and your allies, you've had these wars in Afghanistan, you've had the war in Iraq. They didn't work out. Our war is going to be different. We're going to go in to support our allies. We have clear objectives and we're going to achieve them. And certainly in the short term, and one might argue the medium term, that's how it turned out.
In your book, you identify the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 as a significant moment for Russia in the way that it viewed the West and the intention of Western leaders towards former Soviet states. What happened in Georgia that was so pivotal to Russia's thinking?
In 2008, Georgia is led by a very pro-Western president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who, to the extent that Georgia had even sent troops to assist the United States in the occupation of Iraq. This was part of their bid to join NATO. Earlier that year, though, we have the NATO summit in Bucharest, at which both Georgia and Ukraine promised membership, but without being given a formal membership action plan. Now, the former British ambassador to Moscow, Sir Roderick Lyne, said he puts this as possibly the worst bit of diplomatic drafting ever. The reason being it satisfied nobody. It didn't satisfy Georgia or Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO, but it provoked Russia. So it didn't achieve anything. This is in the spring of 2008, this NATO summit, and by the summer, Russia is at war with Georgia.
Russian forces, including air, land, sea, and airborne forces, are massed against and attacking our sovereign nation.
It's a very short-lived war. Georgia does initially manage to hold on to the territory, but is soon driven back within a matter of days by an overwhelming military response from Russia. If Mikhail Saakashvili hoped for any kind of military support from his Western allies, he's bitterly disappointed. The West is clearly not willing to go to war over this. The effect of this is that Russia has shown that it's willing to use military force beyond its borders to achieve its aims in international relations. The other thing is, though, it also exposes a lot of military shortcomings. After this, we see reforms in the Ministry of Defense. I think Putin and the rest of the Russian political elite learn from this and embark on a program of reform which enables them to pursue these military operations far more effectively in the future.
You talked there about what it meant for Russia in terms of how it understood its military shortcomings, but what did Russia's invasion of Georgia mean for its relationship to Europe at that time and the way it viewed Europe and Europe's inability to fight back?
There's really no sort of consequences for this. Russia is suspended from the G8, that's true. But aside from that, there was no sort of real sense that this wasn't business as usual, and there wasn't really a very strong response. And it's something that a number of people I interviewed for the book reflect on, arguably something more could and should have been done to say to Russia, no, you've crossed a red line here. We're not going to tolerate this. Because afterwards, Russia eventually, in 2014, annexes Crimea. And then in 2022, of course, escalates the war in Ukraine to an entirely different level.
Coming up, how Putin understood the political potential of Russia's post-Soviet national humiliation, and why it led him to invade Ukraine. That's coming up after this short break.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladmir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.
James, in 2014, the Crimean Peninsula, which most countries recognise as Ukrainian territory, was occupied and annexed by Russia. This laid the groundwork for the full-scale invasion in 2022 of Ukraine. How does what happened in the 90s and the early 2000s and that trajectory that we talked about help us understand why Putin eventually decided to invade Ukraine?
Crimea occupies a very special place in the Russian imagination for the reason that in 1954 it was transferred from Russia to Ukraine, but this was largely a symbolic move done by the then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev because both countries were then constituent parts of the Soviet Union. It made very little difference in practice. But it occupies a very sort of special part in Russian history and in the Russian imagination.
There was jubilation in Crimea as word came that Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow had signed a treaty that will incorporate the Ukrainian province into Russia.
It's only a little more than 2 years since we've seen at the end of 2011 mass protests against alleged fraud in the parliamentary elections that took place in December that year, and also mass protests against the fact that Putin, after having had 4 years as prime minister, proposes to return as president after a single 4-year term for Dmitry Medvedev. So there's hundreds of thousands of people turn out in the streets. This is something that really does unite people across the political spectrum. And this is a time when the conflict starts in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, with Russia encouraging separatists there covertly and overtly. And I think if we look at the Putin era as a whole, he's always understood very well what his constituency wanted. He understood the political potential of that humiliation in a way that I think some Western policymakers did not understand the possible political consequences of it. Putin himself, of course, having served as a KGB officer in the former German Democratic Republic in East Germany, gives an interview in the summer of 2000 when he first becomes president, in which he talks of his return. He says, "I understood that the country didn't exist anymore." And that's a line that really stuck with me when I was doing my research, because I think you can make the case that the whole of the last quarter century have been about Putin trying to show not only his own people domestically, but the world as a whole, that Russia very much does exist. So blessed with, particularly by rising oil prices, of course, Russia a major oil exporter in his first decade in power. Russians enjoy living standards not only much better than what we've had in the decade before, but in some cases the best they've ever known. Then after that, he sets about restoring the international standing. And we see Crimea, we see Syria, both of which are huge successes from the Kremlin's point of view. And in the case of Crimea, particularly rewarded with huge approval ratings.
Do you think Russia is a superpower now? And do you think that it thinks it's one?
That's a really good question. I think it thinks it's got back a lot of its status. I think that's a lot of what Putin has been about. In the run-up to the escalation of the war, we saw this long essay in the summer of 2021 that Putin published about the unity of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, and put his core argument being that actually this is all one country. Ukraine and Belarus are made-up entities. and also his harking back to the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russian more normally. I think in that terms, that's very much the way that certainly Putin sees itself. And of course, it's much harder to know how the Russian people see themselves because we don't really have access to a great deal of information from that. But I think Putin wants to get back to a world in which European security is largely decided in Moscow and Washington, as it was in the Cold War, and Europeans have relatively little say in it. I also think that Putin wants to get to a stage where nothing happens in Europe, and it's certainly not in the military or security sphere, to which Russia does not consent, and if it does, it has the ability to act to try to prevent it.
So we're on the eve of 4 years of war in Ukraine. You've been writing this book during that war. How has tracing this history made you think about what may happen next and the way to end the war in Ukraine?
At the moment, I cannot see the kind of terms in which this conflict could come to an end. I guess there will be people on both sides who would like to stop fighting, but the core issues have not been resolved. We understand from the talks, the US-sponsored talks, that the main sticking point seems to be that Ukraine is supposed to give up some of its eastern regions to which Russia has laid claim and which have been formally actually incorporated into the Russian Federation from the Russian point of view. That seems a tremendous sticking point to me, and I don't see how Ukraine can possibly agree to that, nor, though, do I see how Russia can stop fighting until it has achieved that. So I think that is just a huge obstacle that will be very difficult to overcome. A lot of Ukrainians probably feel, and with good reason, that even if this war does end and there's something upon which Putin feels he can say to people, look, we've achieved this, we've made this victory, it doesn't mean to say that something similar wouldn't happen again in the future. The other thing to consider, I think, from a Russian domestic political point of view, is that the economy is very strongly on a war footing at the moment, and there are also how many hundreds of thousands of Russian men under arms who one day presumably will return to the Russian Federation, many of them traumatized, some of whom, of course, were released from jail for serving sentences for violent crime in order to go and fight in the army. And there's no obvious rehabilitation for them in terms of mental health care, in terms of employment. So there is a kind of incentive for Putin to keep the war going from that point of view, because at the moment the system is working in a way that it wouldn't necessarily do in peacetime.
Thank you so much, James, for talking us through what you've learned and that history and what it might mean for the future. We appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
My pleasure, Gemma. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more analysis by academic experts on the 4-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine on The Conversation, and we'll put some links to further reading in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware, with editing help from Ashlyn McGee. Sound mixing is by Elena Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you value what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the show wherever you follow us. It really does help us reach new people. Thanks very much for listening.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards, and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Bamgott. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot, and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
You know, me being an anatomist, I was like, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.